The dawn broke over landscapes that seemed more like nightmares than the world the survivors had once known. Smoke still curled from smoldering ruins, the jagged skeletons of buildings casting long, eerie shadows across streets that had been homes, marketplaces, and schools. Warsaw, once the vibrant heart of Poland, lay in utter devastation. Dresden, the jewel of Saxony, had been reduced to ashes and rubble. Tokyo and Hiroshima were barely recognizable, their districts flattened into a wasteland. Everywhere the eye turned, there were reminders of what the war had taken, not just lives, but the intricate architecture of daily existence, the invisible threads of community life that made a city functional, humane, and alive. For millions returning from the front, or emerging from shelters and refugee camps, the sight was almost unbearable, a silent, concrete testimony to the magnitude of destruction, and a question that demanded an answer: how could they rebuild from nothing? In the face of this devastation, city planners, architects, engineers, and governments were confronted with the most complex challenge of the 20th century, to reconstruct not merely buildings, but entire societies, economies, and systems of living. It was immediately clear that the war had not only destroyed infrastructure but had also exposed the weaknesses of pre-existing urban layouts. Narrow, winding streets that had once given European cities their charm had become death traps during bombings and fires. Overcrowded housing and outdated public facilities had contributed to the suffering of civilians, and antiquated transport networks had hindered emergency responses and supply movements. The challenge was not simply to repair but to reimagine, to take the opportunity to design cities that could endure both the pressures of population growth and the risks of future conflicts, while still preserving the identity and memory of what had been lost. Warsaw, despite its obliteration, became a symbol of this delicate balance between memory and modernity. The old town was reconstructed brick by brick, guided by historical paintings, photographs, and surviving records, recreating its pre-war charm as a testament to national resilience. Surrounding neighborhoods, however, were redesigned to incorporate modernist principles. Wide avenues replaced narrow streets, standardized apartment blocks provided efficient housing for the displaced, and zoning regulations separated residential areas from industrial and commercial zones. Architects such as Le Corbusier and Walter Gropius influenced this vision, advocating for sunlight, ventilation, and open communal spaces, reflecting a new philosophy that considered not just shelter, but quality of life, movement, and safety. The planners were clear: the city had to remember its past while embracing a functional and progressive future. In Germany, cities like Dresden and Cologne took a different approach, focusing on speed and practicality alongside preservation. Prefabricated housing and modular construction methods allowed new neighborhoods to rise within months, addressing the urgent need to shelter millions of displaced citizens and returning soldiers. Historical landmarks, including churches and municipal buildings, were reconstructed in a blend of old and modern architectural styles, creating an urban environment that honored cultural heritage while integrating contemporary efficiency. Streets were widened, bridges rebuilt, and entire transport networks overhauled to accommodate the realities of modern life: rising automobile ownership, growing populations, and the lessons learned from wartime devastation. Utilities and essential services posed another layer of challenge. Water mains had fractured, electrical grids were in ruins, and sewage systems had been compromised. Cities like London, which had endured the Blitz, saw the reconstruction of hospitals, sanitation networks, and power systems as vital to restoring normalcy. Modern technology was integrated wherever possible, transforming destroyed infrastructure into more resilient networks capable of withstanding both natural disasters and future conflicts. Urban reconstruction was no longer just about architecture, it became an exercise in social engineering, shaping the rhythms of everyday life and ensuring that the scars of war would not permanently disrupt society. Transportation infrastructure, meanwhile, required extraordinary coordination and foresight. Railways, tram lines, and roads had been obliterated, isolating communities and cutting off vital supply chains. In response, planners sought to create networks that were not merely replacements but improvements, capable of handling increased traffic and providing efficient public transit. Grid systems replaced chaotic medieval layouts in new districts, bridges and tunnels were reconstructed with both strength and capacity in mind, and roads were widened to allow for evacuation, emergency access, and future urban expansion. Every design choice reflected lessons learned from the wartime experience. Cities had to be navigable, resilient, and prepared for the unpredictable. The human dimension of reconstruction was equally urgent. Millions of refugees, displaced families, and returning soldiers required housing, food, employment, and education. Cities had to recover not only physically but psychologically, restoring a sense of community and stability. In Tokyo, new neighborhoods were planned with parks, playgrounds, and community centers to integrate recreation and social cohesion into the urban environment. Rotterdam, which had been almost entirely flattened by bombing, was rebuilt with pedestrian-friendly avenues, cultural centers, and civic spaces, demonstrating that post-war reconstruction was as much about human experience as about structures. Cities were designed to remind residents that life, despite its interruption, could continue with dignity and order. Cultural identity remained central to these efforts. Warsaw's meticulously rebuilt palaces and public squares became symbols of national perseverance, while Hiroshima incorporated memorial parks alongside new commercial and residential areas, balancing remembrance with functional urban life. Cities were no longer just places of residence, they were monuments to survival, spaces that combined utility, memory, and hope. The planners understood that reconstructing a city meant restoring not only buildings and roads but the social fabric that allowed citizens to live, work, and envision a future. Ultimately, the reconstruction of post-war cities was a vast, multi-dimensional task that demanded innovation, collaboration, and endurance. It required architects to blend tradition with modernity, engineers to rebuild functional networks, and communities to adapt to entirely new ways of living. The ruins were not simply obstacles, they were canvases for new ideas, opportunities to build cities that were safer, more resilient, and better suited to the needs of modern life. In the ashes of Warsaw, Dresden, Tokyo, and London, urban planners, architects, and citizens alike saw the possibility of rebirth. Each reconstructed street, every rebuilt bridge, and all restored public spaces became symbols of human ingenuity and resilience, testifying to the capacity of societies to rise from devastation, not just as survivors, but as architects of a better, more sustainable urban future. Rebuilding mobility, roads, rails, and the flow of life. The war had left more than buildings in ruins, it had shattered the very arteries that connected cities, towns, and nations. Roads were fractured, bridges toppled, railways torn apart, and ports rendered useless. In the weeks following the armistice, engineers and planners faced a logistical puzzle on an unprecedented scale: how to restore the flow of people, goods, and services across devastated landscapes. In cities like Rotterdam, London, and Tokyo, the destruction of transport infrastructure threatened to paralyze recovery. Without functioning roads and rails, relief supplies could not reach hungry citizens, factories could not resume production, and commerce could not begin to revive. It became clear that rebuilding mobility was not a luxury, it was the lifeline of survival and renewal. In Rotterdam, the once thriving port city had been almost entirely flattened. The bombing had torn open canals, smashed docks, and obliterated warehouses, severing connections between inland factories and global trade routes. Urban planners seized the opportunity not just to rebuild, but to reimagine the city's transport network. Roads were straightened and widened, canals dredged and reinforced, and new bridges were constructed with higher load capacities. This approach not only restored functionality but anticipated future growth, creating an infrastructure capable of supporting increased trade, larger vehicles, and higher population density. Rotterdam became a blueprint for the integration of modern transport planning with urban reconstruction, showing that mobility could serve as the backbone of post-war recovery. Railways, often targeted during wartime, required equally urgent attention. Tracks had been bombed, stations destroyed, and signaling systems disabled. In Germany, engineers coordinated vast repair operations that spanned hundreds of kilometers, often under harsh conditions and with limited resources. Reconstruction involved not only replacing tracks but improving their alignment, modernizing switches, and reinforcing bridges. The goal was to create a rail system that was faster, safer, and more reliable than before the war, capable of transporting both passengers and freight with efficiency. In addition, planners integrated railway networks with urban design, ensuring stations were accessible from residential neighborhoods and connected to road and tram systems. Mobility became a multi-layered network, linking city, suburb, and industry in a coordinated flow. Road infrastructure also evolved dramatically. Pre-war streets, often narrow and winding, were no longer suitable for modern vehicles or emergency services. Cities like London and Milan embraced wider avenues, one-way streets, and arterial roads designed to reduce congestion. The war had demonstrated the critical importance of redundancy in transport systems. A single destroyed bridge or bottleneck could paralyze an entire city. Planners implemented bypasses, overpasses, and ring roads to distribute traffic, creating a resilience that would protect against both natural disasters and future conflicts. Streets were not merely passageways, they were instruments of efficiency, safety, and foresight. Public transit, too, received a revolutionary overhaul. Trams, buses, and subway lines, often halted or destroyed during the war, were repaired and extended. In cities like Paris and Berlin, tram lines were rerouted to connect new neighborhoods created during Reconstruction, while bus systems were modernized to increase frequency and capacity. Subway lines were expanded or reconstructed with reinforced tunnels and improved ventilation, reflecting both technological innovation and lessons learned from air raid shelters. The integration of different modes of transport, road, rail, and subway, was planned meticulously, allowing citizens to move efficiently across both old and new urban districts. Mobility became a central element of civic life, restoring not only function but dignity and freedom to populations emerging from years of restriction and fear. Ports and airports, essential for international trade and the revival of economies, were not forgotten. Hamburg's port, heavily damaged by bombing, underwent extensive reconstruction with reinforced docks, expanded cargo handling areas, and modernized cranes. Air transport infrastructure, increasingly important in the post-war era, saw airports rebuilt with longer runways, modern terminals, and integrated road access, enabling faster movement of people and goods both domestically and internationally. These hubs became focal points for economic recovery, demonstrating how transport planning could directly influence prosperity and stability. The reconstruction of mobility was not only a matter of engineering, it required coordination, vision, and innovation. Engineers and planners worked alongside governments, military experts, and local communities to prioritize projects, allocate scarce resources, and sequence repairs. Decisions were informed by wartime experience, bridges and tunnels were reinforced to resist bombing or natural disasters, roads were widened to allow for emergency vehicles, and transport routes were diversified to prevent complete disruption in case of localized damage. Every street, rail line, and bridge represented a delicate balance between immediate need and long-term strategy, reflecting lessons learned under fire. Beyond functionality, planners recognized the social and psychological impact of mobility. Efficient transport systems restored a sense of normalcy, allowed families to reunite, and facilitated access to markets, schools, and workplaces. Pedestrian zones and parkways were introduced alongside roads to improve urban livability, while public transit encouraged social interaction and community cohesion. Mobility was more than movement, it was an essential ingredient of post-war recovery, linking individuals to opportunity, society, and hope. Cities that rebuilt their arteries effectively were the cities most likely to thrive, demonstrating that the flow of people and goods was inseparable from the revival of civic life. The process was slow, labor-intensive, and often fraught with setbacks. Supplies were scarce, skilled labor had been depleted by years of war, and damaged infrastructure complicated every project. Yet, across Europe and Asia, the determination to restore movement never wavered. Citizens, engineers, and planners shared a singular vision, a connected, resilient, and modernized urban environment that would not only recover from war but surpass what had existed before. Roads, rails, ports, and public transit became symbols of reconstruction, testaments to human ingenuity and the capacity to convert destruction into opportunity. By the end of the decade, the results were evident. Cities had regained functionality, trade networks were operational, and citizens could travel, work, and interact with a freedom that had been denied during the war. Modernized streets facilitated commerce, rebuilt railways transported goods and people efficiently, integrated transit systems enabled urban expansion. In every bridge rebuilt, every railway repaired, and every street widened, there was a story of survival, collaboration, and forward-thinking design. Post-war mobility was not merely a technical achievement, it was a social, economic, and psychological triumph, proving that human ingenuity could overcome even the most profound disruptions. The reconstruction of transport systems after World War II thus represented both necessity and vision. Roads, rails, ports, and public transit were the veins of the new urban body, carrying the lifeblood of society across devastated landscapes. They reflected lessons of the past while embracing innovations for the future, creating networks that were resilient, efficient, and socially transformative. In the years that followed, these reconstructed arteries would enable not only the recovery of cities but also the growth of economies, the integration of communities, and the rise of a modern urban world shaped by both necessity and foresight. Mobility had become more than movement, it had become a statement of human determination and a cornerstone of post-war hope. Innovating renewal, smart rebuilding and resilient cities. In the shadow of destruction, creativity became the blueprint for survival. The war had demolished more than homes and factories, it had obliterated centuries of accumulated urban knowledge. Planners and architects were not merely restoring what had been lost, they were reimagining the very essence of cities. The challenge was immense, to rebuild faster, stronger, and smarter, ensuring that the mistakes of the past would not repeat themselves. Streets, neighborhoods, and infrastructure had to reflect both the urgent need for habitation and the vision of a modern, resilient society capable of withstanding future disasters. Innovation was no longer optional, it was essential. Prefabrication emerged as a cornerstone of this new approach. In Germany, Sweden, and the United Kingdom, standardized building components were manufactured en masse and transported to devastated sites. Concrete panels, steel frames, and modular units allowed entire neighborhoods to rise within weeks rather than years. This method not only accelerated reconstruction but also minimized the strain on scarce labor, while maintaining consistent quality and structural integrity. Architects designed buildings with modular efficiency in mind, ensuring that each unit could be combined in multiple ways to fit varying urban topographies. Prefabrication became a symbol of post-war ingenuity, demonstrating that speed and safety could coexist without sacrificing design or livability. Utilities once overlooked until disaster struck received unprecedented attention during reconstruction. Engineers rebuilt water supply networks with reinforced pipelines, modern pumps, and redundancy systems to prevent disruption. Electrical grids were redesigned to distribute power more efficiently, incorporating higher capacity lines, protective switchgear, and emergency backup systems. Sewage and waste management infrastructures were modernized, preventing contamination and disease in newly populated areas. In Tokyo and London, planners treated these utilities not as afterthoughts but as essential components of urban life, integrating them into building designs, road layouts, and public facilities. The invisible systems of a city became central to its survival and growth, proving that resilience depended as much on infrastructure as on architecture. Innovation extended to the very fabric of urban planning. Cities were no longer constrained by pre-existing layouts that had failed under the pressure of war. Wide boulevards replaced narrow alleys, open public spaces offered both recreation and evacuation routes, and zoning regulations separated industrial, commercial, and residential districts to improve safety and functionality. Parks, playgrounds, and communal gardens were interspersed within neighborhoods, creating spaces for social interaction and psychological relief. Cities like Rotterdam and Milan demonstrated the power of integrating environmental and social considerations into urban design, ensuring that reconstruction was not merely functional but humane. The lessons of wartime destruction were clear: cities had to be built for people as much as for commerce or industry. Disaster resilience became a guiding principle. Buildings were designed to withstand fires, earthquakes, and floods, incorporating reinforced concrete, flexible structures, and fireproof materials. Roads and bridges were constructed with higher load capacities and redundant pathways, reducing the risk of complete isolation during emergencies. Underground shelters, bomb-resistant bunkers, and emergency evacuation routes were planned into the urban fabric. In Hiroshima, reconstruction combined memorial spaces with resilient housing, ensuring that the memory of destruction coexisted with preparedness for the future. Cities were learning from catastrophe, transforming vulnerability into strength through careful, forward-looking design. The reconstruction effort also embraced innovation in social planning. New residential districts were designed with community cohesion in mind, integrating schools, clinics, marketplaces, and places of worship within walking distance of housing. Public transport, parks, and pedestrian zones encouraged interaction among residents, fostering a sense of belonging and shared identity. This holistic approach recognized that a city is more than the sum of its structures; it is a living organism shaped by the patterns, needs, and well-being of its inhabitants. The war had shattered communities, but reconstruction offered an opportunity to rebuild society itself, not just its physical components. Economic revitalization was tightly linked to urban innovation. Industrial zones were strategically placed near transport hubs, ports, and rail lines to maximize efficiency and reduce logistical bottlenecks. Warehouses, factories, and commercial districts were constructed using modern materials and methods, facilitating faster production and distribution. In Rotterdam, the port became a centerpiece of recovery, integrating smart traffic flow, loading efficiency, and accessibility. In European cities, Reconstruction plans included marketplaces and trade centers designed to stimulate commerce and provide livelihoods for thousands of citizens. Urban planning and economic strategy became inseparable, ensuring that reconstruction created not just habitable spaces but sustainable, thriving communities. Technology played a decisive role. Engineers employed new surveying methods, aerial photography, and early computer-assisted mapping to plan street layouts, utility networks, and building placements. Innovations in construction machinery, concrete reinforcement, and prefabricated assembly enabled large-scale projects to proceed rapidly without compromising quality. Cities became laboratories for modern engineering, where lessons learned under the pressure of wartime scarcity were transformed into systems capable of supporting post-war prosperity. Reconstruction was not simply reactive, it was an experimental, forward-looking process, blending technical innovation with social foresight. By the end of the first decade after the war, the results were striking. Cities that had been obliterated now hummed with life. Streets teemed with pedestrians and vehicles, factories buzzed with production, and neighborhoods were populated with families benefiting from thoughtfully designed housing. Public services functioned efficiently, parks and communal spaces promoted social interaction, and resilient infrastructure ensured that the failures of the past were unlikely to repeat. Prefabricated buildings, reinforced utilities, and modern street layouts had transformed devastation into opportunity, demonstrating that intelligent design and innovation could turn even the harshest destruction into a platform for progress. The story of post-war reconstruction was one of imagination as much as effort. Where bombs had created voids, planners and builders envisioned potential. Where bridges and roads had crumbled, engineers plotted networks that would support generations to come. Where utilities had failed, innovators built systems capable of sustaining entire cities. Reconstruction became a testament to human ingenuity, a demonstration that even after unparalleled destruction, society could rebuild smarter, stronger, and more resilient than before. Cities were no longer just remnants of the past, they were laboratories for a future in which human foresight and technical innovation could coexist to create urban environments that were safe, functional, and full of life. In the end, the blueprint for rebuilding was more than architecture or engineering, it was a philosophy of resilience. Prefabricated housing, reinforced utilities, smart urban planning, disaster preparedness, and social integration combined to create cities that could withstand both natural and human-made challenges. The war had exposed vulnerabilities, but reconstruction transformed those vulnerabilities into lessons, guiding every decision from street layout to sewage design to community planning. Innovation became the defining mark of recovery, proving that cities could rise from ashes not merely restored, but reimagined for a better, safer, and more connected future. From ashes to life, economic revival and cultural rebirth. As the smoke cleared from bombed-out cities and the last rubble was cleared from streets, another, less visible battle began, the reconstruction of society itself. Physical rebuilding roads, buildings, bridges was only the first step. The true challenge was to restore life, livelihoods, and a sense of normalcy to millions whose routines, work, and communities had been shattered. Cities were no longer just architectural projects, they became theaters of economic revival, social cohesion, and cultural restoration, where the human spirit would determine the ultimate success of reconstruction. In the immediate aftermath of destruction, economies lay in tatters. Factories had been reduced to charred shells, ports and railways were crippled, and local markets had disappeared along with the businesses that supported them. The urgency was immense. Without work, families could not feed themselves, and without commerce, urban recovery would stall. Governments and planners recognized that rebuilding had to go hand in hand with economic revitalization. Industrial zones were reconstructed near transport hubs, providing access to ports, railways, and roads. In Rotterdam, the city's reborn port became a lifeline for trade, allowing imports and exports to resume at a pace that bolstered both local and national economies. Elsewhere, cities like Birmingham and Turin focused on reconstructing factories using modern techniques, ensuring that production could resume efficiently while accommodating future technological advancements. Employment, too, became a crucial priority. Reconstruction itself was labor-intensive, providing work for thousands of citizens displaced by war. Skilled engineers, architects, and laborers collaborated with unskilled workers, turning devastation into opportunity. Construction sites became hubs of training and skill transfer, equipping communities with the abilities necessary for long-term economic independence. At the same time, governments promoted incentives for businesses to reopen or relocate to rebuilt districts, ensuring that commerce would flourish alongside residential neighborhoods. Reconstruction was not simply about bricks and concrete, it was an engine of economic regeneration, binding the revival of cities to the livelihoods of their citizens. Cultural restoration was another critical dimension of recovery. Cities that had lost centuries of architectural heritage, churches, theaters, and museums faced the task of restoring not just structures but identity itself. Warsaw, painstakingly reconstructing its old town, became a symbol of resilience and continuity, demonstrating that cultural heritage could coexist with modern urban planning. In Dresden, portions of the historic city center were preserved amidst modern apartment complexes and commercial buildings, blending memory with innovation. Hiroshima, devastated by nuclear bombing, integrated peace memorials and cultural spaces alongside residential and commercial reconstruction, ensuring that collective memory shaped, rather than hindered, the life of the city. Cultural restoration became a method of psychological recovery, reminding citizens of the continuity of human achievement even after destruction. The social fabric of cities also required careful attention. Housing projects were designed not only to shelter but to nurture communities. Schools, hospitals, and recreational facilities were integrated into neighborhoods to provide essential services and promote cohesion. Parks, playgrounds, and pedestrian areas encouraged interaction among citizens, fostering a renewed sense of belonging and shared identity. These initiatives reflected the understanding that recovery was not complete without addressing the human dimension. Mental health, social bonds, and communal resilience were as vital as physical infrastructure. Cities became living laboratories where urban design and social policy intersected, creating environments in which citizens could thrive both physically and emotionally. Innovation continued to play a role in long-term recovery. Advances in construction materials, prefabrication, and infrastructure management accelerated rebuilding while ensuring durability. Utilities were modernized, transport systems expanded, and urban layouts redesigned to prevent congestion, flooding, or inefficiency. Cities were no longer reactive spaces, they were proactive frameworks designed to accommodate population growth, technological progress, and potential emergencies. Lessons learned during the war about fire, bombing, evacuation, and supply chain disruption were codified into building codes, urban regulations, and planning methodologies. The future of cities was now being shaped by the experiences of the past, creating urban environments that were safer, more functional, and more adaptive than ever before. Education and civic engagement became pillars of recovery as well. Citizens were encouraged to participate in planning committees, local governance, and community projects, ensuring that rebuilding reflected the needs and values of the people it served. Schools taught not only conventional subjects but also civic responsibility and disaster preparedness, embedding resilience into the next generation. The process of reconstruction became democratic, collaborative, and educational, transforming passive victims of war into active architects of their own futures. Communities learned that recovery was not